Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Olivia Olmos, and I'm the Events and Programs Associate at SCAMP. Today's panel is titled Universal Basic Income, Direct Cash Transfers, and the Eradication of Poverty, New Research on Strategies with Promising Results. Universal Basic Income, also called Universal Guaranteed Income, has gained attention in recent years as a strategy to alleviate poverty. While SCAMP members know firsthand that affordable housing is a proven and important method of poverty alleviation as a foundational step to improve social outcomes, we hope today's session helps inform you about other successful poverty alleviation strategies that may complement efforts to stably house those most in need. We have an amazing panel of guest experts who will share results and developments with you about various programs across the country and in Canada. Today's speakers are Heather Hay, Senior Consultant and Transitional COO at Foundations for Social Change, Stacia West, Assistant Professor at the University of Tennessee College of Social Work, and Amy Castro-Baker, Assistant Professor at the University of Pennsylvania in the School of Social Policy and Practice. Stacia and Amy are the co-authors of the SEED report. Then we'll move on to Hope Wolensack, the Senior Strategist at the Economic Security Project, and wrap up with Lucius Martin, the Special Projects Officer at City of Long Beach Economic Development Department. Here's the agenda for today. We'll start by hearing about a direct cash transfer program in Canada with very promising results, and we'll save a few minutes at the end for questions. So please post any questions for the speakers in the Q&A box on your Zoom menu. And as a reminder of today's timeline for the session, Governor Newsom proposed in his budget millions of dollars in resources to fund UBI pilot programs. We'll keep an eye out on how that fits into the final budget. And with that, I'll turn it over to Heather to start the program.
Sorry. There we go. Thank you, Olivia. I'm very happy to be here together with such an amazing panel and to have the opportunity to share our work. We're Foundations for Social Change, and we're a brand new charity and nonprofit that is working out of Vancouver, BC, but hoping to expand across Canada this coming year. Our focus is primarily on supporting scientific projects and moving them from project to policy. I'm currently working as Chief Operating Officer. I have a long history in housing and mental health and addictions here in Canada, and I have a passion for working with marginalized populations. I'm going to share with you today a little bit about a study project or a pilot project that we did here in 2019 to 2020 called the New Leaf Pilot Project. So slide, please. So the New Leaf Pilot Project was a randomized controlled trial, which the Foundations for Social Change did in combination with the University of British Columbia in partnership. And an overview of the pilot project was we distributed unconditional cash transfers to individuals who were homeless, $7,500 in cash, as well as we provided them workshop training, financial support training, and guided them with counseling support through their process. We also provided coaching, and we provided additional resources through honorarium, replacement ID, access to a checking account, resource booklet for additional resources throughout the neighborhoods, and a used smartphone. Next slide, please. Our pilot population was recruited primarily from 22 shelters around Metro Vancouver. Our shelter system here in Vancouver and throughout the Lower Mainland is primarily funded through BC Housing, which is a provincial housing, provincial housing provider, and the shelters are actually part of their continuum of housing. And they're self-selected to nonprofits to run those and manage those shelters. Our clients were screened for program eligibility to ensure the highest likelihood of success So what we were looking for primarily were individuals who were newly homeless, who did not have a significant or complex mental health or addiction issue. So there was no misuse of alcohol or substance use. They needed to have a Canadian citizenship, and their length of time homeless was probably less than 2 calendar years. Our age group, which we looked at, were 19 to 65-year-olds, recognizing that children in care currently and those that are homeless are working outside the system at 19. Next slide, please. So who's the New Leaf Pilot Project? So in total, we had approximately 115 participants who were successfully enrolled in the study. The age group was between 19 to 64. We had 58% male, 40% female. 34% of those individuals also had children. And although there's an overrepresentation of Indigenous people within our homeless population here in BC, we were only able to reach approximately 12% of the Indigenous population in order to be able provide support for this project. The average time homeless was 6 months, and 24% of the clients did not have personal ID. One of the interesting things, though, is that 28% of them actually did have employment, and many of them had more than 1 or 2 jobs. Next slide, please. Next slide, our impact. So our results in distributing the unconditional cash transfer was extremely positive. It was particularly positive across these 6 domains: housing stability, spending, savings, food security, employment, and executive function, which primarily is the ability to problem solve and to manage your life appropriately or safely. Next slide, please. In housing stability, in only 1 month, 50% of our cash recipients moved into stable housing. 75% of the cash recipients moved into stable housing by 12 months. Each cash recipient spent 88 fewer days homeless per year than the non-cash participants. And I should probably share with you that we had 115 people were successfully enrolled in the study. 50 of those were provided with cash transfers. The others were used as control. Next slide, please. On money management, what we found was each cash recipient retained approximately $1,000 more in savings over 12 months, which actually was surprising given the fact that I think a lot of mental models around homeless people actually suggest that they're unable to actually save money, or that money is actually spent inappropriately over time. Next slide, Olivia. Our gender-based analysis plus outcomes identified that women cash recipients saved more and spent more money on their children than men did. And from our BIPOC sample size, cash recipients saved more, increased their pay per hour, and their executive function was higher more than white cash recipients did. So in our expansion project, as we move forward, we want to actually look more closely at this outcome and see what the actual are the indicators that have impacted this result. Next slide, Olivia. Our spending showed that cash recipients spent more money, or most of their money, on rent, food, clothing, durable goods, transit, and most importantly, on their children. And I think it's actually dispelling the myth that a lot of individuals who are homeless may be utilizing their funds or money on alcohol or drugs. And we have actually an interesting outcome. Next slide, Olivia. I think it's the next slide, is food security. In only 1 month, 65% of our cash recipients achieved food security, and more cash recipients became food secure by 12 months. Next slide, Olivia. Here's temptation goods. Temptation goods are actually identified as alcohol, drugs, or cigarettes. And what we actually saw through the pilot project was that there was a significant reduction in spending on temptation goods by the sample size. So I think in our previous slide, we actually identified to you how the dollars were spent, and those dollars were spent unconditionally. So people actually were able to prioritize what were the dollars that they had, how they wanted to spend it for the month. They also had an opportunity to work with our banking facilities to be able to set up their own bank accounts and actually be able to secure some financial training, because many of our participants said that they were never had any education or support around budgeting or finance allocation. So I think this kind of dispels a lot of the mental models again and the myths that we have about our homeless population, certainly here in Canada. And I think, again, as we move forward on our expansion projects, this is an area that we want to take a closer look at, or a deeper dive. Next slide, please. One of the exciting things, I think, for us, and I think for the shelter system of support, was that our pilot project demonstrated that each cash recipient saved $8,172 more over 12 months via reduced reliance on shelter services. So what we saw actually is an increased capacity within our shelter services as those individuals were able to move out of shelter into supported housing or into more stable housing over time. And it generated for the shelter system approximately $672 in net savings per person per year. And although our sample size is extremely small, I think that cost savings will be increased, obviously, when we increase our sample size. But also what we also demonstrated is that there was a significantly reduced reliance on other kind of community supports, such as healthcare services and other nonprofit supports. Next slide, please. Our next step for our projects are, we're actually working with the City of Toronto to look at an expansion project there, where we would look at 200 unconditional cash transfers to individuals. We're also midway through our planning here in Vancouver for our expansion project in Vancouver. Similarly, it would look at 200 unconditional cash transfers and 200 controls. We have been shortlisted for a large research grant called the Transformational Project, which we'll find out in August whether or not we're successful. That's a $26 million grant that will see us do this expansion project in Vancouver, Toronto, and Halifax. And we've been working really closely with many partners in North America and in the United States to actually replicate our work in other city centers. Yeah, so I think that's it for me, Olivia. Thank you. Any questions, please ask.
Great, thank you, Heather. We'll move on to Stacia and Amy next.
Hi there. Thank you, Heather. I am a huge fan of your work, and that was fascinating. So thank you so much for sharing. We can go ahead and get our slide share.
One moment.
Great, thank you so much. So we're speaking about the Stockton Economic Empowerment Demonstration, which is one of the first city-led guaranteed income demonstrations in modern US history. So occurred in Stockton, or is still occurring in Stockton, California. We started dispersing cash in February of 2019. And so what we're going to present are the one-year findings. I just want to give you a brief overview of sort of the research design, because what we focus on a lot in this presentation is really digging deep into the mixed methods findings. So It was a mixed methods RCT. What we did is we took a random sample of rooftops within Stockton in specific census tracts that were at or below the area median income. We then invited people to apply for the program online. Really, there were no criteria that you had to meet other than you had to be 18 and you had to live in Stockton. And then randomly assigned folks 125 into the treatment condition, 200 into the control condition. The treatment condition received $500 a month for 24 months. So that just ended in January of 2021. Control condition only participated in research activities, and those entailed surveys every 6 months, as well as in-depth interviews. So what we're presenting here is the synthesis of those first year findings. Next slide, please. So we asked 3 key research questions. First, how does guaranteed income impact monthly income volatility? Second, how do changes in income volatility impact psychological health and physical well-being? And then finally, how can guaranteed income generate agency over one's future? So next slide, please. So the first question, how does guaranteed income impact monthly income volatility? So income volatility, of course, meaning that many folks month over month cannot predict what their paycheck is going to look like. And that fluctuation is one of, a leading stressor for folks. So if you'll just hit the button for me, please. Thank you. So in the treatment group, we saw those receiving the $500 a month for the year had much lower rates of income volatility with 46% month over month volatility compared to 67.5% in the control group. That's still a lot of volatility, right? So even our kind of benchmark, one of the few studies that we have looking at month over month income volatility, lower income populations typically have between 35 and 50% volatility month over month. So while the treatment condition is more within that range of what we are kind of normed on, it's still quite a bit of instability. So we know that this allowed folks to stabilize and plan for the future. All right, and one of the things that we often hear is there are so many American families that are unable to pay for an emergency expense with cash or a cash equivalent. So we measured this at baseline and at 1 year, and you can see here the treatment group. There's a pretty precipitous increase in those that are able to cover an unexpected $400 emergency expense with cash or a cash equivalent via credit card that they would pay off. Whereas the control condition only improved about 3 percentage points over that same time period. Amy, do you want to talk a little bit about liquidity and pooling?
Yeah, so on the face of it, these findings are kind of self-evident. If you give people more money, they're going to have more money for emergencies, right? But what matters more is sort of how they stretch that money and how it impacts their health and well-being. So the first thing I just want to note is that we know that people live in networks, they live in families, and so it's not just about the individual who's receiving that $500. But the ways in which the stressors that were in their broader networks, we saw essentially a kind of a spillover effect. That's how we talk about it qualitatively. I know that term is used differently quantitatively, to where families were really able to stretch that bandwidth that came from that additional additional $500 to patch holes in the safety net and holes in the market in ways that many times their family members were unaware of. So in most cases, most of the people who were in the experiment kept it private and did not tell the other people in their network that they were actually members of the treatment group. But we still saw a smoothing effect, not just among those people who are actually, the named people in the experiment, but then food insecurity within the broader network was alleviated, as well as some shifts in unpaid care work.
Next slide, please. So the next research question, how do changes in income volatility impact psychological health and physical well-being? The reason why we ask this question is because we know that after a certain period of years of experiencing financial strain or insecurity, it begins to have impacts on your body, and physically on your body, and then psychologically, actually, in just a number of months, you can see those changes start to show up. So can guaranteed income change that? So what we found over the year is that recipients of the guaranteed income were less anxious and depressed both over time and compared to the control group. This was measured using the Kessler-10, which is a very widely used instrument to measure anxiety and depression. We also used the short form health survey 36, and we saw that recipients reported improved emotional health and well-being, more energy, less fatigue, compared over time and compared to the control group. So those were outstanding findings. Next slide, please. So this is my favorite chart of all time. These are the marginal means of the Kessler 10. And I feel
She's
that this
not
chart is
joking.
just,
She says that every time.
I
she-
love it. I love it.
When
Okay.
when she had the chart together, she called and said, you have to see the chart. So yes. It's an amazing.
Okay, so you can see our treatment group and our control group over time here, right? And our control group kind of hovering in this space of meeting criteria for a mild mental health disorder based on the Kessler 10. Whereas if you look at the treatment group over time, from time 1 to time 4, you can see a pretty dramatic decline in their scores of reported anxiety and depression. So again, a fantastic finding. Next slide, please.
Yeah, so I think what partly why we get so excited about that slide is that, you know, obviously because we're seeing it shift, but second, I think one of the things that's striking is that if you look at it, you see that almost everyone who is in both treatment and control started out meeting the criteria, clinical criteria for either anxiety, depression, or both at the start of the experiment, which I really think speaks to the ways in which capitalism is showing up in people's bodies, and sort of those failures in the market are actually getting underneath the skin. And so what we saw with this when we sort of did a mixed methods integration was that first those decreases in anxiety and depression, and then of course extreme financial strain, actually created some bandwidth and increased capacity for goal setting. So what this means practically speaking is that it obviously alleviated things. You can see this quote here from a recipient who said it was literally relieving panic attacks, but it also created some bandwidth to actually breathe and have some space to set goals that they weren't able to set prior, simply because they were caught in this scarcity trap of constantly fighting finances and constantly fighting anxiety and depression. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. And then second, the $500 also served as a form of paid care work that really allowed women in particular to focus on their health and on their own well-being, and to kind of subsidize gaps in family health care that they had been really putting off. So in many cases, things like dental treatment that they had needed for a really long time, or preventative health care. So things like that you would expect to see, but then also really people choosing themselves and choosing to take care of themselves rather than working an additional shift or spending more time in unpaid care work, like to the detriment of their own health and well-being.
All right, our next question. How does guaranteed income generate agency over one's future? And this was answered in 2 parts. So the first part, or actually 3, changes in employment, changes in risk-taking and goal setting, and freedom from forced vulnerability. Next slide. So if the Kessler 10 is my favorite chart, this is my favorite table. People who receive a guaranteed income do not stop working, right? Many of us that have been in this space for years know this. The literature has told us this time and time again. Heather Hayes' study just told us as well that people find better employment, more full-time employment. So you can see a 12 percentage point change in the treatment group compared to themselves at 1 year, and then only a 5 percentage point change here in the control condition. And so these are folks that actually shifted from part-time or unemployment to full-time employment over the course of a year. So looking at this, I'm like, why did this happen, right? So this is why we do mixed methods. Next slide, please.
Yeah, so one of the things that we do when she says mixed methods, what we mean is that we have multiple streams of research that are occurring at the same time. So one, obviously, we're using traditional quantitative measures, which Stacia has just been presenting. But then 2, what we do is we follow up with people in in-depth interviewing and short form ethnography to determine how and why those changes are taking place. So one of the things that we learned qualitatively was that, like, understanding how and why we saw such big employment changes, which initially was not even one of our primary research questions. The first was that the $500 really removed material barriers to full-time employment. So things like being able to take a shift off of work, to actually go and apply for the job. So in many cases, people knew they were eligible for better employment or for some type of a promotion, but their margins were so tight on time that they could not take a shift off of work in order to take the risk of actually applying for a new job or completing an internship or completing some type of a certificate. The second was at this sort of like kind of the capacity for risk. And so if you think about risk, what you need in order to take a risk is, first of all, that financial bandwidth, right? But you also need that cognitive bandwidth and sort of that emotional stability to be able to jump and take a risk, knowing that you have that $500 behind you, cushioning you. And so you can see this one recipient here who said, I think one thing is definitely risk. You can take so much risk. There was a time, the only reason I believe I got the internship was because of me taking the risk of not having to quit a job. And knowing that I have that money, I could sustain myself until this new opportunity came around and I was able to take it. And so we really see that kind of the infusion of cash really created this time bandwidth and this removal of material barriers that allowed people to set new goals. And we saw the similar things with women, like these findings applied to both female and male identified people, but for women, it was somewhat curtailed based on the limits of care work for many obvious reasons if you do work in this area.
Next slide.
Yeah, and then finally we saw really this freedom from forced vulnerability. And so if you think about the conditions of poverty, or if you're living at or below the poverty line where you're really struggling to make ends meet and you're not thriving financially, you're forced constantly into having to choose between 2 bad choices or 3 bad choices, and you're forced to be vulnerable on systems and on people that you might not want to engage with. And so in contrast, chosen vulnerability hinges on agency or self-determination and authentic trust, rather than being forced to trust a system or a person you might not want to. For instance, choosing someone to watch your children because you have no choice. So what we saw was that with the $500, it disrupted this cycle in some small ways that were pretty meaningful for folks, such that it allowed them to choose who they wanted to be in relationship with, and choose where they wanted to trust, and choose where they wanted to be vulnerable, rather than being forced to. And so I love this quote from a recipient who says, poverty means lack of choice. You're forced in ways you don't want to be. So it's exciting to me to see that such a small amount of money can disrupt this cycle in some degree. Of course, it's a short experiment, that can potentially disrupt this lack of agency that people feel when they are so constrained by lack of resources and by the way that the system is set up in many ways for them to fail or to remain trapped in their situation.
All right, and this is the final slide, I believe, around implications, Amy.
All right, apologies. So some implications for other projects moving forward. So first was that we saw a constant theme of mistrust. And so communities that we were working with in Stockton, and we've seen this in other experiments that we're replicating, or excuse me, in other locations where we're replicating right now, is that these are the same locations that are constantly targeted for risky lending, for scams, for predatory practices, people who've been locked out of upward mobility for decades, right? And so that lack of trust in systems and in people, which is, well, like it's there for good reason. It drove engagement with the program, it drove policy take-up or programmatic take-up, and it really drove spending patterns. So we saw that the way that people moved money around off of the debit card and into other institutions was really driven by rational action of saying, hey, I've been burned by these systems in the past. Why should I trust this professor from Penn who's telling me it's going to work this way? So that has really key implications for those of us who are thinking about scaling this up and scaling it out across a whole city or a whole county, is saying, like, how do we rebuild trust within communities who've been marginalized since, like, essentially the founding of our country, right? And then second, there's some real structural limits to guaranteed income. It's not a silver bullet. We wouldn't claim it to be, even though the press sometimes it describes it that way, right? And we saw really 3 places where there was a limit to the cash in Stockton specifically. First was the cost of housing. So while that $500 definitely alleviated household budget strain, when you're talking about the massive gaps in lack of affordable housing that were present in the community, it really could only scratch the surface of it. Second was the cost of childcare. Not surprising for anybody who's in California, you sure you know well what that looks like. And then third, the lingering cost of healthcare, if there's a catastrophic illness or a really persistent disease within the family system. And so we really see those limits as places for opportunity. And in the long run, thinking about how unconditional cash can be paired up with other policy proposals in these 3 categories to really close the loop on some wealth gaps and other forms of structural injustice.
All right, I think that's it for us. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Stacia and Amy. We'll now move on to Hope.
Thank you, Station Amy. What a phenomenal presentation. And I love how they sort of closed thinking about like these limits are actually not failures, they're opportunities for policy advocacy that we actually need to pursue alongside guaranteed income. I'm here to, hi everyone, I'm Hope Wolensack. I'm a senior strategist at the Economic Security Project. And I'm gonna be sharing with you all today the guaranteed income community of practice. I want to make sure just everyone can see my screen. Can I maybe get a thumbs up from one of the other presenters or
You can see your screen.
Terrific. And so the Guaranteed Income Community of Practice was started in early 2021, in large part building on some of the momentum of SEED and a couple other pilots that were happening across the country, and this sort of growing interest in guaranteed income and direct financial support as a tool of economic recovery, but also of long-term financial stability, especially for communities that for so long have been marginalized and exploited. So the Guaranteed Income Community of Practice is made up of 200 various organizations from around the country, all advocating for guaranteed income in some way. And I think really this is rooted in the theory of change is rooted in this specific King quote. I'm now convinced that the simplest approach will prove to be the most effective. The solution to poverty is to abolish it directly by now a widely discussed measure, the guaranteed income. He wrote this in his final book, along with many other policies that he advocated for, but really seeing that the current social safety net, current programs that sought to eliminate poverty were just piecemeal and pygmy in his words. And so guaranteed income actually has a very long history, although we're now seeing lots of movement on a local levels across the country. As I mentioned, the community of practice brings together 200 diverse stakeholders from across the country. Everyone's entry point is a little different. Some are researchers, academics, practitioners, maybe elected officials who are non-mayoral. And really this community of practice is intended to be a place of shared learning. Much of this is new in many places. And so folks we're learning together and answering a lot of big questions together. It's really driven by the members themselves. And we're grateful that the community of practice is co-convened by Mayors for a Guaranteed Income, the Economic Security Project, UPenn, Amy and Stacia are some of the co-conveners, and a few other organizations. So very glad to have that representation and that guidance as we're building this community. There are 4 pilots from the Guaranteed Income Community of Practice. We're members of the Guaranteed Income Community of Practice are working on that I felt like might be relevant to highlight for the purposes of this meeting. And that is the Newark Movement for Economic Equity. This is a Mayors for Guaranteed Income project, and it's led by Mayor Baraka. Zero Babies Homeless, a New York City direct cash transfers pilot, and then Denver basic income pilot. These 4 projects, in addition to the New Leaf project that was talked about in the first presentation, are some of the main projects that look to answer questions around guaranteed income and housing insecurity or homelessness in some way. And many of these have just started or in their early phases or have yet to launch, but we're excited for some of the learnings that will be coming out of these programs. And I think that these are great opportunities to be answering some of these big questions around housing affordability and guaranteed income. One program I believe that's really worth highlighting, all of them are phenomenal, but this one in particular, Point Source Youth, is a program out of New York City. It's a pilot where 40 youth will receive $1,250 a month for 2 years. The amount is the equivalent to the cost of shared housing in New York City. So it's a total of $30,000 over 2 years. And really the rationale for the program itself is derived from the problems that exist in New York City, especially around affordable housing. First, youth experiencing homelessness are disproportionately BIPOC, Black specifically, and LGBTQ youth, also trans women of color. And New York City spends a lot of money on trying to solve this problem, $47,000 a year per shelter bed for a total of $3 billion per year for a system that if you've worked in homelessness services and specifically in New York City, that folks are pretty dissatisfied with across the board, despite potentially good intentions. So whether you are running a shelter, building a shelter, staying in a shelter, whoever, sort of all of these stakeholders tend to be pretty dissatisfied with the problem, and a lot of money tend to be dissatisfied with the current status quo of solutions. And so why not try something new, in the words of Larry Cohen, the director who manages this program. There's a rigorous evaluation for phase 2, and then an RCT for phase 3, with the idea that this program may be something that could be scaled. Additionally, the program participants don't have to stay in New York City. They can choose to move wherever, and they still receive the set amount for 2 years. It's a mixture of public and private funding, and really this program, and I'm really conveying some of their learnings. Larry Cohen is a phenomenal leader who leads this program. They feel like it's ethical, it's the right thing to do. It puts power in the hands of youth, and it's targeted towards communities that need it the most by program design, and it's cheaper and likely more effective than the alternatives that they're currently approaching. And so I highlight this program to say that there are lots of folks in this space who are thinking about the intersection between housing insecurity, affordable housing, and guaranteed income, and what that can look like, and how that can inform actual program design, and how it can meet the needs of community members who are often most marginalized by the system. I think this is a great time to highlight sort of just even what we mean by guaranteed income, and the interplay between affordable housing and guaranteed income. By guaranteed income, we mean regular cash payments accessible to members of a community with no strings attached and no work requirements. And most importantly, guaranteed income is meant to supplement, not supplant, existing social safety net benefits. This is really important because if the goal is to give folks greater economic security or enable greater economic security, the last thing we would want to do is supplant current benefits. And this is a huge struggle actually for pilot programs. So in the guaranteed income community of practice, there are about 50 pilot programs that are in one stage or another, whether they're being planned or they've fully been executed. And so guaranteed income is good at providing income stabilization and is really impactful across a number of outcomes. But it's important that it's actually paired with other benefits, especially those for which there isn't really a good equivalent cash substitute, housing and healthcare being sort of the top 2 areas that come to mind on that. And so a lot of these guaranteed income programs, and this may be some information folks already know, but I'll share, a lot of the guaranteed income pilot programs that are popping up spend a ton of time thinking about how they navigate the benefits cliff. And so if they're providing an additional $500, $800, $1,000 a month to this population of folks, how do we ensure that they're able to maintain their current public benefits, including, really importantly, housing benefits, or at least mitigate the loss or compensate the loss that folks might be experiencing? This is a very long and complicated process that almost reveals in many ways the complexities in the bureaucracy, often by design, of our social safety net. Programs have used, including SEED, have used multifaceted approach to ensure recipients are better off, including coordinating with agencies, seeking waivers, pursuing state level legislation to exclude the cash transfers from income, and many more depending on their context. But probably not new to many folks on this call, this is a highly bureaucratic process, oftentimes with administrative error built into the system by design to often keep folks out. And so it really does reflect the fragility of the social safety net. Again, this isn't, this doesn't mean we don't pursue guaranteed income. It actually, I think, is a calling and a reckoning for a broader reform of the social safety net that keeps many people out in the moments they need it most. And that as soon as you get a foothold of economic security, an extra $500, $800, $1,000 a month, there are benefits that are immediately taken away from you. And so it's really difficult for folks under the current system. And this varies some by state and locality, but it's really difficult under the current system to reach true economic security, because we've set up a system where there's essentially a tightrope, and you have to be in deep poverty oftentimes to really access these systems. And you really have to prove repeatedly your deservedness, which obviously has racial and gendered implications. I think anecdotally on this, housing agencies and many of their partners have been some of the most supportive public benefit agencies. I'm here in Atlanta, Georgia, and I can speak to some of the programs here. Sort of our housing partners have been the most supportive. Maybe this is because this occurs at a local level, but certainly some of the most supportive partners in allowing essentially guaranteed income program participants to maintain their current housing benefits. And I think that continued collaboration is sort of inspiring and a good precedent for other agencies that oftentimes cannot be as supportive. Additionally, when I think about affordable housing and guaranteed income, I think about the mechanisms HUD may have to provide cash transfers to families, especially with additional relief funding under CARES initially and now under ARPA. And that guaranteed income really must occur alongside improving affordable housing. I worry sometimes to the extent that landlords have monopoly power over the cost of housing, which in many cities they do with a little regulation, including here in Atlanta, that, you know, if there is a population receiving guaranteed income, that they can be further exploited for that. So I think that complication is just a call for greater protections and greater investment in affordable housing alongside guaranteed income. That's it. I think really my point here is to say that I think as we're exploring guaranteed income and there are pilots popping up across the country, there are a ton of learnings, a lot of research, a lot of expertise to bring to the table, not just for folks who advocate for cash policy work, but I think across the board of all of these different policy areas, and that I'm really excited to see where it goes. And we're building a lot of this and learning a lot of these lessons together, and we're excited to have people be a part. So if you're leading guaranteed income or cash transfer work in your community, we'd be glad to have you join the community of practice, either the national table or the California-based table. And we work closely together. And this is my email address at the bottom. Just shoot me an email and I'd be happy to extend an invitation to you or to a colleague.
Thank you, Hope. We'll now move on to Lucius.
Thank you. My apologies. My office is basically on the Long Beach Airport property, so we might hear some Hawaiian Airlines or Southwest jets throughout the presentation. I'm based here. I think most everyone on the call, maybe besides our other incredibly distinguished panelists, which I'm so humbled of, are based here in Southern California. So I don't have to dive into, you know, what Long Beach is or how big we are. You know, we're one of I think the 7th largest city in California. We're probably in the top 30 or 40 throughout the United States. We're much larger than many cities that people think about, including Miami and Madison and St. Louis and Cincinnati. But we're really excited. Our mayor, Dr. Robert Garcia, was one of the early signatories to the mayoral guaranteed income project, and we'll go to the next slide. And, you know, this quote is so important to our mayor, but also just understanding the foundation and the shoulders that we stand upon for this work. You know, as already mentioned, called out 54 years ago by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the importance of guaranteed income and how it can be used as a tool to abolish poverty and income inequality. So very important. I'll talk a little bit about what's happening here in Long Beach. Things were expedited as of early spring of this year. In April, we began a task force, so we can go to the next slide. That truly represents the totality, the diversity, and the brain trust of our city and our residents. It includes several PhDs from economics, folks that are working for our Cal State University system, folks that are the executive directors of private foundations based in Long Beach, folks connected to mental health nonprofits, community members with lived experience. And so we're really excited about this. We have a large task force. We're meeting again for our 5th time coming this Friday. We're pulling together data to offer up a pathway for our city council to make a final decision on, hopefully within the next month or so. Once that happens, we're looking at doing participant selection in the fall. And by January of next year, we'll begin our pilot and getting that direct cash assistance in hand of participants. So one of the charges we had is to figure out what the need was, where the funding will come from. Working with our government affairs director, the Long Beach is receiving a large amount of American Rescue Plan Act money. We're taking a look at $2 million of that, which we may be able to get an additional $2 million matched by an allocation, a set aside that's been created by our governor recently to match guaranteed income pilot programs or projects within California. So right now we're really looking at $2 million. That money has to be tied in because it's ARPA funding with communities, residents, businesses that have been impacted by COVID-19. So we'll go to the next slide. So obviously we're currently looking at what communities in Long Beach have really struggled, have been the most impacted. These are the communities that are the most diverse. They've struggled the most economically. They've been hit the hardest over the past 1.5 years since the pandemic started. And so we'll go to the next slide where we're beginning to dive a little bit deeper. We're looking at households. There's 166,000 households in the city of Long Beach. We're looking at specific zip codes, and we're starting to see some interesting trends show up. There's a zip code, a 90813 here in Long Beach, which actually includes our historic Cambodia town. It also includes our most historic high school, Long Beach Poly, Washington Middle School neighborhood. That's kind of south of the center part of Long Beach, north of downtown, what we call downtown Long Beach. And this area, we've noticed that the median household income is consistently lower than other areas in Long Beach. And we'll move on to the next slide. We're looking at family composition. We're looking at how many of these households are families, folks married with children, single with children, single females with children, and other classifications of families. Next slide. And of course, I think what the difference between kind of your classic UBI program in Southern California, we have a lot of tribal nations that have UBI programs or redistribution programs for gaming revenue. If you think of Morongo, Pachanga, San Manuel, they essentially have these UBI programs where they're redistributing gaming revenues on a monthly basis to enrolled citizens of the tribe. We're obviously a guaranteed income program. There are going to be some specificities to who's eligible to apply. And then we're really targeting that income inequality. So, families in poverty, again, the zip code pops up for us. 23% of those families in that area are living in poverty. We're starting to see some real numbers that are more tangible for us. How many are single-headed families, single female-headed families with children in poverty? And we'll go on to the next slide. And so, what we're starting to kind of wrap around, and again, none of this is official yet because we have other folks that are looking at this for us that need to approve of the recommendations made by city staff and our task force. But if we had 1.5 million, that would give us $500 a month for 1 year for 250 treatment participants or households. And what would $500 represent if we looked at single female-headed households as an example of that total population? That would represent 18% of median annual income. It would be 34% of annual income for the lowest 25% of earners, and it would represent 33% of the average gross rent currently in Long Beach. Looking at just the SNAP, the CalFresh, the food assistance allocations, a household of 2 only gets $430, a month. So this would essentially potentially double the money available for them for food. And I believe we can go to the last slide. Just wanted to make sure folks have my contact information. We're really excited about this pilot. It's incredible to think that we have families living in such poverty. I was looking at MIT's living wage calculator yesterday, and I was blown away that, a single head of household with one child in LA County would need to make $42 an hour or $88,000 annually to live free from any type of public assistance. And we're talking about families that are living on less than half of that. They're trying to subside here in Long Beach. So we're really excited to join the greater pilot movement, to be able to produce some data. And again, just so honored to be here with the rest of the guests, and stay tuned. Hopefully there'll be an announcement made in the next month or two about what direction Long Beach is going to take for this pilot. So thank you.
Thank you, Lucius. We'll now move on to the Q&A portion.
I see one question asking about the slides. So the answer to that is yes, we'll provide slides as well as the recording of this presentation to all those who registered. We have a question from Jane who says, if cash does not supplant existing benefits and adds to funding for people experiencing homelessness, what are the incentives for policymakers to scale up? Is it possible to replace some or portions of existing programs, given that cash is more effective and beneficial? Is there someone that wants to take a stab at that?
I can respond to that. In Canada, what we've done is actually worked with the provincial government and the federal government so that people can actually retain their existing benefits, and there is no fault for them actually receiving the direct cash transfer. So, and that's actually a policy change that they're renewing across the cities where we're actually moving forward to do the expansion project as well. So I think that that's been an extremely helpful new policy shift for us here in Canada to help to support those. And actually a recognition too is that the social safety net that's currently in place is just not enough.
Thank you, Heather. And then someone asked about reposting contact info. So it looks like the speakers have done that in the chat box. It looks like there aren't any other questions. So I think we will leave it at that and thank our panelists for giving us their time today and sharing their expertise. And we'll go ahead and say goodbye. Thanks all.
Thanks for having us.